always loved taking late-night walks. There's something calming about the stillness of the world at that hour, like a secret only a few of us share. The cool air, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant hum of a car passing by, all of it gives me a sense of peace. But one night, that peace was shattered forever. It started as a typical walk. I'd left my small apartment around midnight, earbuds in, playing a soft instrumental playlist. My town's streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight or the shadow of a stray cat darting across the road. I wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just letting my feet guide me. That's when I saw it. The old house had always been there, on the edge of town, sitting like a forgotten relic. I must have passed it a dozen times before, but I'd never paid it much attention. It was just another abandoned building, its windows shattered, its paint peeling, and its roof sagging under years of neglect. But that night, something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the way the moonlight hit the broken windows, casting strange shadows on the overgrown lawn. Or maybe it was the faint creak I thought I heard, like the house was calling to me. Whatever it was, I found myself standing at the rusted gate, staring at the dark silhouette of the house. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to, but there was a pull, a curiosity I couldn't shake. Before I knew it, I was pushing the gate open, the metal groaning loudly in the quiet night. My heart pounded as I walked up the cracked stone path, each step feeling heavier than the last. The front door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. It creaked as I pushed it open wider, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air was thick, cold, and heavy with the scent of rot and mildew. I hesitated on the threshold, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. "Just a quick look," I whispered to myself, as if saying it out loud would make it less foolish. Inside, the house was a ruin. Broken furniture littered the floor, along with shards of glass and scattered debris. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, revealing patches of mold underneath. Every step I took made the floorboards groan loudly, the sound echoing in the emptiness. As I moved through the house, I noticed something strange. Despite the decay, there was a feeling of presence, like I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to my imagination, a natural response to being in such a creepy place. But then I saw it. In the corner of what must once been a living room stood a large, ornate mirror. It was completely out of place amidst the ruin. Its frame was gilded, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. The glass was spotless, reflecting the beam of my flashlight perfectly. I was drawn to it, my footsteps carrying me closer before I could think to stop. Standing in front of the mirror, I stared at my reflection. Or at least I thought it was my reflection. At first glance, everything seemed normal. My tired eyes, my messy hair, the hoodie I'd thrown on before heading out. But as I leaned in, I noticed something off. My reflection wasn't moving the way it should. I tilted my head to the left. It tilted to the right. I raised my hand. It stayed perfectly still. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I realized what I was seeing. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its eyes were darker, its skin pale and lifeless. And then it smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't belong on a human face, too wide, too sharp, and filled with something that felt wrong. My knees nearly buckled as I stumbled back, but the reflection didn't mimic my movements. It stayed there, grinning. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. The grin grew wider, stretching impossibly across its face. And then, without warning, it raised a hand and waved at me. I froze, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam of light danced wildly, casting twisted shadows around the room. When I bent to grab it, I risked another glance at the mirror. The figure was gone. Panic set in. I spun around, scanning the room with my flashlight, half expecting to see that twisted version of myself standing in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint creak of the house settling. I needed to leave. Now, I turned and bolted for the door, not caring about the noise I made or the debris I stumbled over. As I reached the threshold, I risked one last look over my shoulder. The mirror was still there, its surface now blank and dull, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Once outside, I didn't stop running until I was back on the main road. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't dare slow down. It wasn't until I reached my apartment that I allowed myself to catch my breath. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the nightmare wasn't over. The next morning, as I stumbled into the bathroom, still groggy from a restless night, I froze. The mirror above the sink showed my reflection, but something was wrong. There it was again, that grin. My reflection wasn't mimicking me. It was staring, grinning that same twisted grin from the night before. I screamed and backed away, nearly tripping over the edge of the bathtub. My heart raced as I grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror, blocking the reflection from view. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every mirror, every reflective surface I passed showed that same grinning version of myself. It was always there, watching, mocking. I tried avoiding mirrors altogether, but it didn't help. I'd catch glimpses of it in windows, in puddles, even in the screen of my turned-off phone. And it wasn't just watching anymore. At night, I started hearing whispers, soft, raspy voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their tone was menacing, filled with malice. Sometimes I'd hear faint laughter, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within my own mind. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it, that grinning face, looming closer and closer. My apartment no longer felt safe. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. Desperate, I tried getting rid of every mirror in the house. I smashed them, threw them out, even covered the windows with black sheets, but it didn't stop. The reflection found other ways to haunt me. One night, as I sat curled up on the couch, clutching a baseball bat for some semblance of security, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You can't run from yourself," it read. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, my pulse racing. Moments later, the lights in my apartment flickered, and the whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding me. I screamed, covering my ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside my head. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark. My flashlight, which I'd kept beside me, was dead. The only light came from my phone lying face up on the floor. On the screen was a photo of me, but it wasn't me. It was the reflection grinning that terrible grin. It's been weeks now, and I've stopped trying to fight it. The reflection is everywhere, always watching, always grinning. I've started hearing its voice in my head, whispering thoughts that aren't mine. Sometimes I catch myself smiling that same wide, unnatural smile without meaning to. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Whatever it is, it's getting stronger, and Before we dive deeper into further story, I just want to quickly mention something important. Check this out. According to the stats, 90% of you are watching my videos but haven't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second and it helps me create more amazing content for you. Your support really means a lot. Let's grow this community together. Late night walks had always been James' sanctuary. The cool breeze, the rustling of leaves, and the distant hoots of owls gave him a sense of peace that eluded him during the chaos of the day. Life hadn't been easy lately. A recent breakup, mounting bills, and a job that felt more like a dead-end trap than a career. But the park was his escape. Under the dim glow of streetlights and the sprawling canopy of trees, he could breathe. It started on a Wednesday night, one of those nights where the air carried a faint chill that prickled the skin but wasn't cold enough to warrant a jacket. James was halfway through his usual route, the gravel crunching under his sneakers when he felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the kind you get when someone's eyes are boring into you. He paused, glancing around. The park was empty, as it usually was this late. Just his imagination, he told himself, resuming his walk. But the feeling persisted. Turning his head sharply, he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting behind a tree. He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing eerily. No answer. Only the sound of leaves whispering in the breeze. He shook his head and laughed nervously. "You're losing it, James," he muttered, continuing his walk. But the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next few nights followed the same pattern. Each time he ventured into the park, he'd catch glimpses of a shadow that seemed to mimic his movements, always staying just out of reach. It wasn't the shadow of a person, though. It was darker, more solid, and it didn't belong to any light source. Sometimes it would stretch unnaturally long, slithering across the ground like a living thing. Other times it loomed tall and imposing, a towering silhouette that sent shivers down his spine. James tried rationalizing it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or stress playing tricks on his mind, but deep down, he knew better. The shadow wasn't just there. It was watching him, following him. One night, after an especially grueling day at work, James decided he'd had enough. He wasn't going to let some figment of his imagination ruin the one thing that brought him peace. He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the park, determined to confront whatever it was. The night was eerily quiet, the usual hum of crickets and distant traffic absent. As he walked, the flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. He felt a shadow before he saw it, that familiar prickle on the back of his neck. "All right, come out," he shouted, his voice trembling despite his attempt at bravado. "I know you're there." The beam of the flashlight swept over the trees, the bushes, the empty benches, nothing. Just when he began to doubt himself, a voice whispered his name. "James." He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The shadow was there, no longer darting away but standing a few feet from him, shapeless and undulating like smoke trapped in a vacuum. There was no light to cast it. It simply existed, defying all logic. "What do you want?" he screamed, his voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to move closer. James stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root and landing hard on the ground. The flashlight rolled out of his hand, its beam flickering and dying. Darkness enveloped him, but the shadow remained visible, darker than the night itself. "Leave me alone," he pleaded, crawling backward. But the shadow kept advancing until it loomed over him, its formless mass swallowing every ounce of light and hope. James woke up in his apartment, drenched in sweat and trembling. He didn't remember how he got home. His last memory was of the shadow bearing down on him, its inky tendrils reaching out like fingers. The encounter left him shaken, but he convinced himself it was just a nightmare. Stress could do that, right? But the shadow didn't stay in the park. It began appearing in his apartment, lurking in corners, slipping under doors and pooling at the edges of his vision. No matter how many lights he turned on, it was always there, waiting, desperate for answers. James began researching the park. He discovered that decades ago, a young woman named Emily had been attacked and killed there during a late-night jog. The case had gone unsolved, but locals whispered about her spirit lingering, seeking justice. James wondered if the shadow was connected to her, but deep down, he knew it was something far darker. He reached out to a local historian, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, who had spent years documenting the park's history. When James mentioned the shadow, Grayson's face paled. "You've seen it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "What is it?" Grayson hesitated before answering. "It's an old entity, older than this town. It feeds on fear, growing stronger with each victim. The more you fear it, the closer it gets. And once it's strong enough," he trailed off, his expression grim. "What happens then?" James pressed. Grayson's eyes met his. "It takes you." The revelation sent James spiraling. He tried to avoid the park, but the shadow's presence grew more oppressive. It whispered his name in the dead of night, its voice a chilling echo that filled his apartment. It showed him visions of the park's history, of Emily's brutal death and countless others who had fallen victim to its grasp. The entity wasn't tied to Emily. She had merely been one of its many prey. One night, James reached his breaking point. The shadow appeared in his living room, larger and more menacing than ever. It whispered his name, its voice filled with a malevolent glee. "Why me?" James demanded, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from me?" The shadow seemed to shudder, its form writhing as it spoke. "You summoned me. Every night you walked in the dark, I grew stronger. Your pain, your fear, your despair, I fed on it all. And now, you are mine." James fell to his knees, the weight of the entity's presence crushing him. Memories of his late-night walks flooded his mind, each step an unknowing invitation to the darkness. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't know." The shadow loomed closer, its form engulfing him. "It doesn't matter. Fear is what binds you to me, and you have so much to give." James wasn't seen again. His apartment was found eerily untouched, the lights still on and his belongings undisturbed. But those who walked through the park at night began to feel that prickling sensation at the back of their necks, the fleeting glimpses of a shadow that seemed too dark to be natural. And sometimes, if the night was quiet enough, they'd hear a voice, faint and trembling, whispering from the darkness, "Run, before it's too late." The rain fell in a soft drizzle, soaking Claire's hair and jacket as she made her way home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the diner. Her feet ached, and her thoughts were foggy with exhaustion. But the familiarity of the quiet streets in her small town brought a faint comfort. She tugged her scarf tighter against the chill and quickened her pace. Claire didn't mind working late. It paid the bills and kept her mind busy. But tonight felt different. The streets were too quiet. The usual hum of distant cars or the chatter of late-night walkers was absent. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her boots hitting the wet pavement. Then she saw him. Under the flickering streetlight about 20 feet ahead stood a man. His shoulders were hunched, and his face was obscured by the hood of a dark coat. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, despite the cold rain soaking his silhouette. Something about him sent a ripple of unease through her. Claire's pace faltered. She debated crossing the street, but convinced herself it was just some guy, maybe waiting for a ride or enjoying the rain. Still, her stomach churned as she approached. She kept her head down, her heart pounding louder with each step. As she passed the man, she heard it. A whisper, so soft she almost didn't catch it. Claire. She froze. Her name, it was unmistakable. Her eyes darted to the man, but his face remained hidden in shadow. Her throat tightened as a wave of icy fear swept through her. She forced herself to move, her legs shaky as she sped up. Don't look back, just keep walking. Her apartment was only a few blocks away. She focused on the thought of locking the door behind her, of the safety of her small, cluttered living room. But when she reached the next streetlight, her breath caught in her throat. He was there. The same man, standing motionless under the next lamppost, closer now. It wasn't possible. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen him pass her. And yet, there he was, the faint glow of the flickering light casting eerie shadows across his figure. Panic surged through her. She turned and ran. By the time Claire reached her apartment, she was gasping for air. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, the rain making it harder to grip them. She finally managed to unlock the door and slammed it shut behind her, bolting it tightly. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her ears straining for any sound outside. But all she heard was the rain pattering against the windows. She tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. After all, she was exhausted. But the way he whispered her name… Claire shook her head and grabbed her phone. She considered calling her best friend, Maya, but hesitated. What would she even say? That a creepy guy stood under a streetlight? That he somehow beat her to the next one? It sounded absurd. Instead, she checked the locks on her windows and doors, drawing the curtains tightly. The familiarity of her apartment, the worn couch, the stack of dishes in the sink, the faint scent of lavender from her diffuser helped her calm down. She made herself a cup of tea, the warmth soothing her frayed nerves. But then she saw him. In the reflection of the kitchen window, just over her shoulder, stood the man. He was in her living room, his dark figure blending into the shadows. Claire screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. Her mug shattered on the floor, tea splattering across the tiles. Her heart raced as she backed into the corner, clutching the counter for support. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It's not real." Claire didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set her on edge. She left all the lights on, her phone clutched in her hand as she sat curled up on the couch. By morning, she convinced herself that it had been a hallucination, a side effect of her exhaustion and the stress of her job. But the unease lingered. That evening, as she walked to work, Claire noticed the change in the air. The streets seemed darker, the shadows deeper. She avoided the streetlights, her eyes darting around for any sign of the man. But he didn't appear. When her shift ended, she hesitated at the diner's door, dread pooling in her stomach. She asked her coworker, Nate, for a ride home, but he shrugged her off, muttering about being late for his own plans. Reluctantly, she stepped out into the night alone. Her footsteps echoed as she walked, her eyes scanning every streetlight. The rain had stopped, but the chill remained. She made it halfway home without incident, her anxiety slowly giving way to relief. Then she heard it again. Claire. Her blood ran cold. She turned her head, and there he was, standing under the streetlight behind her. His face was still obscured, but now she could see the faint outline of his lips moving, forming her name over and over. She bolted, her breath hitching with each step. She didn't dare look back. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how many turns she took, he was always there, waiting under the next streetlight, closer each time. Desperation drove her to Maya's house. She pounded on the door until her friend answered, her face etched with concern. "Claire, what the hell? Are you okay?" Claire stumbled inside, locking the door behind her. "There's someone following me," she gasped. He knows my name. He's everywhere, Maya. Everywhere." Mia guided her to the couch, her brow furrowed. "Okay, slow down. Who was following you?" Claire tried to explain, but the words sounded ridiculous even to her. Maya listened patiently but offered a skeptical smile. "It's probably just some creep," Maya said. "You're safe here. We'll call the cops if he shows up." For a moment, Claire allowed herself to believe it. Mia's presence was comforting, her laughter infectious as they tried to distract themselves with an old movie. But then the power flickered, and in the dim glow of the TV screen, Claire saw him. Standing outside the window, his shadow stretching across the room. "Maya!" Claire screamed, pointing. But when Maya turned, the figure was gone. By the next day, Claire was a wreck. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus. The man was everywhere now, in reflections, in the corner of her eye, in the shadows of her own home. She tried to research him, desperate for answers, and stumbled upon an urban legend that chilled her to the bone. The Shadowed Watcher, they called him. A ghostly figure said to appear to those who are alone, whispering their names and following them relentlessly. The stories claimed that once he appeared, he never stopped until his victim vanished without a trace. Claire's hands shook as she read the accounts. Some described seeing him under streetlights, others in mirrors or windows. All ended the same way: disappearance. Claire knew she couldn't run forever. She felt the weight of his presence constantly, an oppressive force that drained her willpower. She thought of her family, of the life she hadn't lived yet, and decided to fight back. That night, she stood in her living room, every light in her apartment turned on. She faced the largest mirror, gripping a kitchen knife tightly. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this to me?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The man's face emerged, pale and hollow-eyed, his lips curling into a chilling smile. "You belong to me," he whispered. Claire screamed, slashing at the mirror, but the shards only reflected more of him, his image multiplying until he surrounded